Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest edition of Shooting Straight with me, Voice of the Forge, from Forgotten Forge Gaming. As you will have noticed on my timeline, things have been quiet recently, and this has been mainly due to the fact that I was nearing the end of a course to go to university. This is now finished, and I graduate on the 29th of June. And so I will be looking at ways in which I can potentially gain more followers over the next 3 years whilst I study law at university. Now this will be UK law, and I do intend to be doing some segments on the subject. Now before I get into the meat of today's examination of events, I just wanted to say thank you very much to all those who have helped me continue to keep Forgotten Forge Gaming on the radar across the very difficult last year with regards to the gaming club that we run. The club that we run is for people with social anxiety or other disorders which means that they have difficulty socialising. And over the last year we have had various issues with finding locations to hold the club. We're now in a position where we want to try and expand. Unfortunately we don't have the cash to do so. So look this way, and hopefully we will be doing more on Forgotten Forge Gaming on this channel. This is part of the reason why this channel was born. One, because I'm a talkative so-and-so, and I enjoy a good debate as much as the next person, hence that's the reason why I'm Voice of the Forge. I don't necessarily speak for other people, but I will be a voice for other people should they need it. That's the idea behind my tag. Now that has been done, there is no other housekeeping. So, what has got my goat this time? Well, it's no surprise to see that we have a referendum coming up in a few days' time in the UK on the future of whether or not we should stay in the EU or leave. Now, this has caused a lot of issues on both sides, where people seem to think that there is only one way to view the facts. Facts remain regardless of the subjective spin that we put on them. And yes, we can all have opinions, but sometimes opinions aren't necessarily informed. And when you have someone who has an informed opinion, then sometimes it behooves us to listen to those who may actually know more than we do. And I am no exception. I will quite happily say, if I say something that you disagree with, check me on it. Because I would much rather get into a discussion whereby we can actually look at the sources that we're using and the facts that we're talking about, and actually open that debate up to a wider audience than get into a shit-slinging contest. If you think I'm wrong, then by all means prove me wrong, and I will be only too glad to have that conversation, because if nothing else, it either, one, backs me up, or two, doesn't back me up. Now if I say something which isn't backed up, then I would rather know that I've got erroneous information than carry on stating something which I believe has happened to be true, whereas in fact it has been countermanded by something else. That doesn't mean to say that just because you find a Wikipedia source that I'm necessarily going to give it the same weight as a definitive source like an encyclopedic website or research done at a university. Just because someone asserts something doesn't necessarily make it so. There has to be weight of evidence there as well. And in the light of the EU referendum that we're going to be having in the UK, I just want to start by saying one thing. We talk about a refugee crisis enveloping Europe. We are talking about mass migration of people, and one of the biggest arguments that everyone seems to have been stuck on, in the UK at least, is whether or not you are a racist for wanting controls to immigration. Now, this is my take on it, right? This is my take. These are things that can be checked out. Now, if I were to go to any other country in the world, bar an EU country, and I happen to meet someone and fall in love with that person, whether they be male, female, pink polka dot or whatever, I would have to earn a set amount of money before I could even think about bringing that person back to live with me as my spouse. That amount has varied slightly over the last few years, but generally tends to sit between £16,000 and £17,000 a year. And the idea is that you should have enough income to be able to support yourself and this partner that you want to bring into the country without them having to rely on state benefits. Now, £16,000 to £17,000 doesn't sound a lot, especially when you take into consideration the national average wage, which is around about £22,000 to £23,000 a year. Now, the problem is that is an average, much like the debunked wage gap, which looks at the average between men's earnings and women's earnings, which only takes into consideration the average of all men versus the average of all women. This too is what they have done with the average wage in the UK. So you are lumping together someone that works part-time at McDonald's for minimum wage at the same time as you're including someone who works in London for Goldman Sachs full-time with bonuses. So that tends to pull the national average up. Now, the area in which I live, the average wage is around about £17,000, but that again doesn't take into consideration people who work for things like the city council, doctors, consultants and everybody else. In order to find a job that pays this 16 to 17,000, if I wanted someone to live with me where I live now that wasn't an EU national, I would have to be looking at managerial status in a job to get anywhere near that kind of money, because the local economy is not that great. And this is only one part of the country. There are other parts of the country where this would also be true. So, as an EU citizen, I cannot manage to bring someone that I might happen to fall in love with and have a proper relationship with into the country without meeting this criteria. As a UK citizen, I cannot do this. So what's my beef? Well, at the moment we have immigration which is running at 300,000 a year. That is a city the size of Birmingham every couple of years. That is huge. That's 1 million people every year, net migration into the country. If we have stricter border controls, points style systems, and we have fewer people taking advantage of the pull factors such as the minimum wage. And the reason why I mention the pull factors such as the minimum wage is if we look at Poland's an interesting example. We had people from Poland coming over here illegally before they acceded to the EU because they could earn maybe £4 an hour on the fields when the minimum wage was about £6, because they were exploited because they were illegal workers. Now that they were going to get paid the minimum wage, that was probably about double what they would get in Poland. So there was a pull factor legally. We now see the Polishes dropping off and tend to be going back because the distance between the amount of money they can earn here and the amount of money they can earn in Poland has decreased. There's no longer this whacking great divide between, oh, I can earn 4 times as much here as I can at home. So it's become more appealing for them to work in Poland, and they get more money than they would have done 5-10 years ago. So that's a pull factor. We can't deny that. But why do I tie this into refugees? Well, if you actually look at what the status of a refugee is, that is someone who has met the standard definition of someone fleeing from persecution. So you're not a refugee if you are moving through countries and applying for asylum. You are an asylum seeker. And until such time as your claim has met the burden of proof, you are not a refugee. Once your claim has made its burden of proof, and it is seen that you do suffer from persecution or an inability to go back to your homeland because of war, strife and everything else, then you become a refugee. Likewise, and I've said this in another podcast, there has been no formal adoption of the actual principles that we signed up to in Dublin. The Dublin Treaty states that if you are an asylum seeker, that you claim asylum at the first safe country that you come to, and then the EU decides, bearing in mind that you can have a preference in this as well, where you will go within the EU. So that means that were you to land in Greece, you aren't to make your way to Norway, or Germany, or Britain, or France, or Spain, before claiming asylum, before claiming you are a refugee. You do it in Greece, you do it in Italy, you do it in Spain. Hell, you can do it in Turkey, because Turkey is trying to get into the EU. Turkey is supposed to be a safe country. And yet this hasn't happened. So we have had this vast migration of people across the Eurasian continent, crossing the Mediterranean, illegally, and then illegally travelling within the free movement area of Schengen. Now, not everyone in Europe has signed up to Schengen, and the UK is one of those, which is why we still have a border in Calais where things are checked. So, if we look at this logically, then there should be no jungle. There should be no camp at Calais where people are trying to illegally enter Britain. If they are refugees, then they will have gone through the system and they will have been designated as being needy of help because they have been displaced and they have met the global legal definition of refugee. But if these people are migrants who are seeking asylum, then they have yet to have made this burden of proof, and they are still waiting. Well, if they are waiting, why are they waiting in France? Because most of them have made their way through the rest of the EU. They have not abided by the terms of the agreement by which a refugee is recognised. This is why we can talk of refugee camps in countries where these camps, where they're still in danger, because people will have gone out there and they will have found people who meet the legal definition of refugee. So these are then people that we need to, for want of a better word, evacuate from that host country and get into a position where they are safe. This is not the same for people who are crossing through Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, Macedonia, Turkey, Libya. These are migrants. These, at best, are asylum seekers. At worst, they are migrants. At worst, they are migrants with no claim, which means that they are economic migrants, which means that they are then illegally moving through the countries and basically are a silent invasion. Now, I use the word invasion in a very strict sense, in the fact that one person has invaded another person's property. If I go to my next door neighbour, break down his door and move into his flat, I have invaded his privacy. I have invaded his living space. And this is what is happening with all of these people that are gaining access to the Mediterranean and coming across on dinghies and landing on Greek islands. They are invading those islands. They may not be under arms, but a movement of people in such a way is still an invasion. And if they are not refugees, because they haven't met the burden of proof, because they haven't followed the law, then there should be things in place to deal with them. Anyway, that is regards to immigration, which is plaguing most of the shall we stay or shall we go rhetoric of the Remain campaign and Brexit. What is far more insidious and is not talked about are the actual changes that the EU want within the UK. And I've been following this debate avidly because whilst I've already made up my mind which way I'm going to go, and I'll leave that to see whether or not you can figure out from my videos, there are things that are not talked about. One of the things that is talked about is the breakup of the UK should we leave Europe. What is not talked about is the fact that in Europe the UK has already been divided into regions. That as far as the EU are concerned, there is no country called UK. There is no Great Britain. There are three zones, or three regions, which they recognise. So as far as the EU is concerned, they've already divided us up into three portions. And if I remember correctly, these portions are diagonal to the way in which we normally see the map of Great Britain, so that Scotland and part of North England becomes one zone, Middle England through Wales becomes another zone, and the South East and South West are the third. So this is already happening. This is already what's on the books. So if you don't want the country to split, if you don't want the destruction of the UK, then the writing is already on the wall. If you stay, you have committed yourself to no longer being a country, but merely being three regions of an EU superstate. If you vote leave, then there are risks and there are things that we may not be able to predict, but we still have the sovereign nation of Great Britain, the United Kingdom. So that's one thing. Another thing, do you believe that people who have been disenfranchised, that is, had their vote taken away for a period of time during incarceration in prison for crimes that they've committed, do you believe that they should be allowed to vote? This was something that was brought in the Victorian era, where it was decided that if you could not follow society's rules, if you could not follow the rules of civilization, then you would have no part in that civilization until such time as you had met and made your reparation. So you would not be allowed to have a vote whilst you were in prison, but once you were freed and you'd served your time, you would then be allowed to vote again. Well, according to the EU, this isn't acceptable. According to the EU, Everyone should have the vote, and just because you've been naughty, just because you have taken away the rights of other people, whether it's the free enjoyment of their property, in other words, you've committed theft, or whether or not you've killed someone, then you're allowed to vote. And there has been a massive campaign in the past to try and get people to see this, and I have seen nothing on this during this campaign. There has been no one who has turned around and said, what about votes for prisoners? And I believe part of the reason why this hasn't become an issue is because the Remain campaign hasn't mentioned it, so because of some kind of unspoken accord with the media and with the Leave campaign, it hasn't become an issue. Now, one of the other things that comes to mind, after all, this is regarding a very complex subject, is the EU rebate and the fact that we are a net contributor to the EU. And much has been made of a figure which has been bandied around at £355 million a week going to the EU. And I have looked at the sources, I have looked at everything that people have said, I've listened to the debates, and at the end of the day, my conclusion is this. £55 million a day does roughly equate to the 355 million which is talked about. Now, where people diverge in opinion is what happens to that figure, because they turn around and say, what about the rebate, what about the money from Brussels and everything else? Now, a lot of people will frame the argument of, if you give someone £100 and they give you £25 back, have you given them 100 or have you given them 75? Well, I view it like this. If I give someone £100 and they keep it for 6 months and then give you £25 back free and clear, and then give you another £25 back and then say that you must spend it on something like wallpaper, then you have given them £100. At a later date, they have given you some of that money back, some with strings and some without. But on the date of 19th of June, I gave them £100. That is a fact. The fact that I get money back later is neither here nor there. At that time and place, I have had to have £100 to give them. That is £100 that I do not have on the Monday, the 20th of June, the 21st of June, or the 22nd of June. Do you see what I mean? This is money that I can no longer count on as having because I no longer have it. The fact that I get £25 back in September, well, yes, you can then argue, well, overall you've given them £75, but I gave them £100 in June. The fact that I get £25 back in September is neither here nor there as to what I've actually given, what I've actually had to have had on my person at a particular date, and whether or not I had it to spend the following day or the day after that. So, 355 million a week is what it costs us, and then at some point we get some of it back and we get a rebate. So, if we work all that out, we then work out the figure that it actually costs us £22 million a day. So this is money that we have lost, it's gone and gone forever. Right, £22 million a day. That's a hell of a lot of money. Why is it that important? Well, it's important because we're giving that money to an unelected federal system. We are talking about a system which in 20 years has never had its accounts verified and being certified as correct due to the level of corruption and incompetence. So we are giving money to people and we can't tell where it's been spent. Now, people will say, oh, but that's 33 million that you're getting back in money and other things. Yes, but when you're told exactly how you can spend it, then it's not exactly free and clear. We are a net contributor to the EU, and what people are trying to say is that we cannot exist without the EU. It's scaremongering. We are the 5th largest economy in the world, and not too many years ago we were 3rd. Let that just sink in for a while. Not that long ago we were one of the really big powerhouses when it came to money, and this isn't going back 50 years, this is probably going back 20. The rights that we have in this country existed before the Human Rights Act was put into our law in 1998. People seem to think that the rights that we enjoy we didn't have before the EU. And this again is another backwards through the looking glass take on it, because we were fundamental in setting up under the Treaty of Rome in 1956 most of the fundamental rights which are contained within this document. The difference is they're what called positive rights versus negative rights. And what a positive right does is tell you that you're allowed to do something. The problem is the fact that with a system of positive rights, unless you're told that you can do something, it's assumed that you can't. Now, which is the more restrictive? Thou shalt not kill. Right? So you won't kill. You're not allowed to kill. Or a system which says you're not allowed to kill except under these circumstances. This is the kind of legalistic determination on which we are balancing our country's future. We are moving towards a system whereby there will be one injunction from EU, and every country is supposed to follow it. The only country that really does is the UK, because France isn't really following it, because if France was following it, it wouldn't have the strikes that it's having. If Greece had followed it, it wouldn't have had the massive bailout that it had due to economic and fiscal mismanagement. Italy wouldn't be a basket case monetarily either, if not for the fact that it didn't follow these guidelines. Yet we seem to have a group of people, a large group of people in this country, who go, oh well, it's better if we stay in because we know what we're going to get. The thing is, we don't know what we're going to get, because as soon as this referendum is over, things are going to be moving forward. There are treaties that are on hold, waiting to see what happens, waiting to see how we vote on Thursday, and then they're going to bring it out once we've actually said yes or no. Now that's a bit devious, don't you think? Just a bit devious. Anyway, these are some of the reasons why I hold the views the way that I do. I would go on longer, but I've just realised I've spoken for half an hour without a break. With no notes, with no script, all the rest of it. That's why it's called shooting straight. I shoot straight from the lip. But yeah, half an hour is more than long enough for any kind of video on political debate. So I will leave it here and leave you to ponder, and if you have any questions, then please feel free to get hold of me on @VoiceOfTheForge on YouTube, or on Twitter, it's the same, @VoiceOfTheForge, and hopefully I'll hear from you soon, before Thursday, so we can have a nice discussion, maybe even a live stream. Thank you very much.